Hello, this is Matt Burns from the University of Missouri, and we're here again today to have a conversation about research. And I'm thrilled to have with me Dr. Stephanie Snyderich, who is a literacy implementation coordinator and researcher with the Lastinger Center at the University of Florida. Stephanie, I'm glad you're here today. Thank you.
Thanks,
I'm going
Matt.
to show you the article we're going to talk about. And this is an article that was in Psychology in the Schools, and it's evaluating the effects of repeated reading and continuous reading using a standardized dosage of words read. Of course, have a couple colleagues, Catherine Mackey and Sarah Adams, worked on this with her. But it's a really interesting study that compared two types of interventions for reading, but really looking at it from a different perspective than most do. And I'm very excited to have this opportunity. I'll tell everyone too, this is very easy to find. I found it on Google Scholar and was able to download the PDF, no problem. So Stephanie, let me ask you a few questions. I'm gonna stop sharing this.
All right.
All right, so let's start with a basic intervention. Tell us about the interventions that you did. And I know you did two, so you don't need to spend a ton of time, but just tell us briefly what those two interventions were.
Okay, so this study compared the effectiveness of repeated reading, which is repeatedly reading a passage during an intervention session, to something called continuous reading. And in continuous reading, which is also known as wide reading in some studies, is just the student continues reading one passage, two passages, or whatever, but they're not repeatedly reading the passages. So that's what we compared in this study.
And tell us a little bit about the method. What did you do?
All right. If you don't mind, I wanted to talk a little bit about the purpose of the study. So it was really, we wanted to build on the existing literature on repeated reading and continuous reading or wide reading. We wanted to examine the effects of those two interventions on oral reading fluency specifically and also comprehension. But there are some unique aspects of the study in that we controlled for the total number of words that students read. So what this means is that all the students in the study actually received the same amount of reading practice. This is really different than typical reading fluency research, which often measures dosage in terms of time. So when they implement the intervention, all the students will do a certain number of timed readings. Often they're 1 minute or 2 minute readings, or they will do the intervention for a certain amount of time. So like there might be a 20-minute intervention or a 25-minute intervention, something like that. And the problem that we saw with this kind of measurement is that even in a controlled study where everyone gets the same amount of time in intervention, even if they read for the same number of minutes, the natural variation in students' reading rates results in some fairly dramatic differences in dosage over the course of the intervention. And we think that this practice has important implications for research and for the practice of implementing reading interventions. Sorry, that's my dog shaking in the background.
It's okay.
So in research, we think that differences in the amount of actual reading practice in terms of the number of words read during the intervention might inhibit us from really understanding the effects of the intervention because there's so much differences in how much reading practice students receive based on their reading rates when they start the study. And then in practice, we think that the typical way that interventions are implemented, where we identify a number of minutes or a number of timed readings to do, might inadvertently be a little bit inequitable and impacting the students who need the most help. So if you think about it, if you have two kiddos, they both have reading needs, they're both below the grade level benchmark for fluency, but one reads 75 words per minute, the other 100. That's a difference of 250 words read for every 10 minutes spent reading. And then over the course of time, that's a really big difference in the amount of practice the two kids receive. So let's say those two engage in the intervention for 5 days a week for 10 weeks. That's a difference of 12,500 words over the course of that 10-week intervention. And if you kind of translate back into what that means for the number of intervention sessions, that is sort of like the difference between the two practices. It amounts to a difference of 3 weeks of intervention for the student who was only reading 75 words per minute. And it doesn't seem like very much, but it probably really does shortchange that student. So in this study, what we did was we took 40 kids and we randomly assigned them to repeated reading or the continuous reading. There were 22 kiddos in grade 2, there were 18 in grade 3. They were all below the 50th percentile with regard to their grade level benchmark on a CBMR probe, so a curriculum-based measurement of reading or oral reading fluency measure, however people are familiar with those. They were all reading accurately, at least 90% accurate. So the reason why we did that was to rule out that the reason for the low reading fluency was due to decoding needs. And then we also screened the students using A-reading, which measures some reading comprehension. And the students engaged in the intervention for 15 sessions over the course of 5 weeks. And I think notably here, and to the point where we're talking about dosage and the importance of equalizing what happens in the interventions in a research study, the mean oral reading fluency score for our sample was 88 words read correct per minute with a standard deviation of 23. So that means the range of reading scores when they started, the rate that students could read per minute was big, is like difference of like 50 words correct per minute. So if we had not equalized the amount of words students read, they would have received very different amounts of practice during the intervention in our study.
Cool. So tell us more then. So you randomly assigned them. And was this pre and post? Did you monitor the progress? What were your measures?
Yep. So our measures were the CBM, are the curriculum-based measurement of reading. So we measured their oral reading fluency at pre and post. We also did A-reading at pre and post. And we also gave students an acceptability measure that they completed a number of times throughout the study, so we could find out which method and was more preferred among the kids. So it was pretty interesting.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what'd you find?
We found, sorry, I forgot to tell you about a really important and interesting measure. So we also had students answer 5 researcher created comprehension questions about the passages, and those were given to the students after the intervention. And they were multiple choice. 2 of the questions referenced factual information in the story. One of the questions was inference and based on info provided in the text. Another one was an inference question that would require the student to leverage some of their background knowledge. And then there was a vocabulary question.
Cool.
So the results were that both groups increased their oral reading fluency score from pre-test to post-test. So that is consistent with, basically all the research on reading fluency interventions. They are effective. They help kids increase their oral reading fluency. So that was not surprising. And the average growth was high, about 3.8 words gained per week. And rule of thumb across different grade levels is about 1.5 words gain per week. So that's a nice robust gain.
When you say 1.5 words, you're saying during intervention, not just regular growth, but during intervention, if you see 1.5 words per minute per week, you're doing pretty well.
I mean, they're at least like making good progress towards the goal. Yeah.
So you had 3.8.
Yeah, when you want to increase that and make those gains even more robust when you're doing intervention, because they're trying to catch up.
Right.
But there were no differences between the 2 intervention types on oral reading fluency or A-reading. So they were both equally effective for the students in general. And there were though significant differences on the median passage comprehension score. So I told you about that researcher created comprehension questions. That's where we saw a difference. So there's a large effect size with repeated reading doing better with regard to those comprehension questions, which was super interesting. And then we also created a scatter plot. So initial reading rate by the growth that students made. And we wanted to know if kids with higher reading rate made more or less progress than kids with lower reading rate in this study where everybody had the same amount of practice. And there was a slight linear relationship between the initial reading rate and that growth. So what that means is that students who were a little bit higher, a little bit faster in their reading, did a little bit better with the practice, even though it was similar across all the kids. Another interesting finding was that students liked the continuous reading better. They were 8 times more likely to rate continuous reading positively on that acceptability measure that we gave to them. So those were
That's
the results.
fantastic. That's awesome.
It was
Uh,
really,
yeah, and you're seeing, preaching to the choir here. I talk all the time about how interventions, there is no such thing as a universal intervention. You need to pick the intervention based on the student's skill and skill deficit. It sounds
exactly,
like that's what you saw as well.
definitely,
Great.
definitely. And when you talk about some of the implications for instruction, we're thinking about closing gaps, right? We're picking students for intervention because they're not achieving at the proficiency levels that we're expecting. So we're trying to get robust gains to happen. And what that tells us, though, at least suggested by the study, is that those lower rate readers actually need more minutes of intervention to read the same amount as the higher rate readers, and that it matters that they get that. Um, Higher rate readers might still gain more quickly than lower rate readers, even when it's equal. So that tells us that maybe we should even compensate further with those lower rate readers by providing them with even more practice if we want to, prevent these inequities that I'm talking about. And then the similarity in the outcomes between the repeated reading and the continuous reading suggests that both are really good ways to practice reading. So basically, kids just need to read a lot. I mean, Ellington said that a long time ago. Just if you want kids to get better at reading, read a lot, and that's not super surprising. Um, but it's nice to see the research show that. And then also that students don't necessarily need to practice reading passages, that just reading widely seems to be effective for improving reading rate. And it doesn't really matter if you repeatedly read or not. That tells us that maybe we could let kids choose what they do. They could do repeated reading one day and continuous another, and it probably might not make any difference. And I think that's especially significant because that kids who struggle with reading don't necessarily like to read. And so any way that you can give them some choice in the selection of passages or how they're reading them might, turn the corner on a particular day if you have a little resistance, say, well, hey, do you want to do repeated or you want to do continuous, and give the child a choice, and they might be a little bit more compliant and willing to do the intervention.
Yeah, sounds great. It's definitely areas for future research, that's for sure. That's cool.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, this is a small study. So, one of the limitations of it is that it's small. It doesn't explore a wide variety of percentile ranges. So, like, would we find these same findings if we really expanded across the entire percentile range of students? Or would we see that this was only effective with some kids in some certain ranges? And for which kids, those are great questions to ask. But with regard to that choice too, and if we think back to what we found with those researcher created comprehension questions, it's possible that a teacher might choose repeated reading when the goal was to increase content exposure or vocabulary exposure, because they give students a chance to hear
Mhm.
certain words several times and, for instance, learn photosynthesis. What is that? Or mitochondria or something like that, because they've read a science passage multiple times. By the same token, a teacher might elect continuous reading just to broaden vocabulary and exposure or broaden content exposure. So I think it kind of depends on what the goals would be. And of course, more research needs to be done. This is just suggesting these implications.
That's a great way to end it then. When in doubt, we need more research. Dr.
Yep.
Snyderich, Stephanie, thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you.